Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everybody.
Now then, this is our first podcast of 2024, and no doubt this year will certainly bring lots to talk about. Sadly, I'm sure we're going to see a number of Section 114 notices throughout the year, and we are no doubt going to hear far more about the role of OFLOG. Dennis will be covering these topics later. 2024 could be a big year, big changes with a general election hotly expected in May, but potentially the autumn, and local elections too. Whatever happens and whenever it happens, our bulletin, our Grapevine podcast, and our vlog will be there to inform you and keep you up to date. So, Dennis, let's get started.
Well, Helen, you might recall that in one of our recent vlogs, we discussed the role of OFLOG, the Office for Local Government, under its new chair, Lord Amias Morse, formerly chair of the National Audit Office. Well, we didn't wait very long for Lord Morse to step into a huge controversy about councils going bankrupt and the reason for this. Here's more. Councils are going bust due to bad management rather than a lack of funding, according to a watchdog, and it's as simple as that. Lord Morse, chair of the Office for Local Government, dismissed the idea that the worrying number of effectively bankrupt town halls was down to a shortage of money. He insisted it was quite definite that failures in management or failures in governance were behind the cases that had emerged so far. Lord Morse, a former head of the National Audit Office, told The Times, all of the failures that we've seen so far, and specifically all of the authorities that are in special measures, are not primarily attributable to a shortage of money. They're to do with failures in management or failures in governance. I really can say this quite definitely, he said. Not so at all, according to Clive Betts MP, chair of the Parliamentary Levelling Up Committee. Speaking to BBC Radio 4, he referenced the recent LGA survey on Section 114 cases and said councils haven't got the funding necessary to fund their ongoing statutory responsibilities. And he was joined in The Guardian by the prominent columnist Simon Jenkins. He also entered the fray, saying, councils are starved of powers and funds and then belittled by ministers. He said the collapse of town hall democracy is a scandal unfolding in real time. Jenkins said many councils have become such dispiriting places to work that able councillors and staff have disappeared. But for a central quango like OFLOG to blame the crisis on local recklessness is grossly unfair. And he went on, in 13 years of austerity, councils have seen a 40% real terms cut in central grants. But Morse did give some indication of how OFLOG will work with the so-called failing authorities. He said that when OFLOG identifies councils that are struggling, the aim would be to step in early enough to prevent them from being forced into special measures, which results in reductions in all non-core services. He added, our approach will be to have discussions about the differentiating data and ask the questions. But it's still the responsibility, he said, of local government to do something about it. As we've seen in our reporting on the financial failures in local authorities, the truth is that management and governance failures have played their part, but so has austerity and the huge loss of central government grant over many years. Many will think that to ignore this only tarnishes the credibility of OFLOG's new chair and the expectations for how OFLOG will perform its role in future. Although I see in the latest report that Lord Morse has tried already to backtrack from what he said originally. Helen.
Well, indeed, and the MJ in particular gives coverage of Lord Morse's comments in the Times, where he's clear that what was reported wrongly portrayed him, and he went on to say that mischaracterization of his views had annoyed and alienated colleagues in the sector. Now, the Committee on Standards in Public Life's newly appointed chair, Doug Chalmers, has said that the Nolan principles of public life cannot be taken for granted, and he is committed to continuing the committee's reputation of carefully researched reports. Now, Mr. Chalmers reflects in his blog that over the years, the committee's work has led to the establishment of so many of the standards bodies and regulators that we now rely on. For example, he states that today it would be hard to imagine a parliament that had no independent commissioner for standards to consider complaints against its members, or that the UK's Electoral Commission didn't exist to regulate and report on political donations and election expenditure. Mr. Chalmers went on to say that keeping standards, processes and systems up to date means that they need to be frequently reviewed. Well-run organisations, he said, regularly assess their codes of conduct and governance, as there will always be new challenges and big questions that might not have been able to foresee. AI is a good example of this. Now, Mr. Chalmers has an interesting history. He began his career in the British Army in 1984 as a private soldier. He served in the Army for 37 years, deploying frequently on operations, and his final appointment was as the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, Military Strategy and Operations. And that's an office he held from 2018 to 2021. He's currently the Master of Emmanuel College at Cambridge and sits on the management board for the University Centre for Geopolitics. And he's also the Colonel Commandant, yes, I did say that right, of the British Army's Queen Division. And we certainly wish him all the best in a role where patience and diplomacy must surely be key skills. And we also wish, of course, all the best to Lord Evans, the outgoing chair, who, of course, remains in the House of Lords. Now, in other news, the Department of Education certainly took a while to get their transgender guidance published, but concerns are now being raised as to what would happen if schools actually follow it, Dennis.
Well, yes, schools are in the news, as is this controversy about planned ministerial guidance on how to treat transgender children. Here's more detail on this. Schools in England could face legal action if they follow new guidance on how to treat transgender children, Minister's own lawyers have reportedly warned. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan and the Equalities Minister Kemi Badenoch have received legal advice that warns of significant legal risks if schools and colleges follow their latest draft guidance, which says they have no duty to allow students to socially transition. Social transitioning includes people changing their preferred names or pronouns and includes school uniform changes. And according to the trade magazine Schools Week, which said it had received leaked information, the advice from Whitehall lawyers on the drafted guidance also cites the need to observe the Equality Act. School leaders responded by saying they were now taking legal advice amid worries that following all aspects of the ministerial advice risk landing them in court. Kate Edgerton, a human rights lawyer at Solicitors Lee Day, said, "It's not surprising that the government's legal advisors have warned there is a high risk of a legal challenge, because it is plain to us that the guidance, if published in final form, is probably unlawful under equality and human rights laws. Following the proposed guidance could put teachers in breach of their legal duties to trans children." And the guidance states that there is no general duty to allow a child to socially transition. But according to Schools Week, lawyers warned that there was a high risk of successful challenge to the guidance on the basis that this statement is both misleading and inaccurate. The draft guidance says primary school-age children should not have pronouns describing them that differed from their sex-based pronouns. But the legal advice was that this could lead to a high risk of legal challenge. Now let us know via the forum page if this is an area that has involved legal challenges and issues for your council. Helen.
Well, yes, schools need appropriate and lawful guidance, Dennis, because they're just simply trying to do the best they can by their children. This is a complex area, and it will be interesting to see whether a challenge is mounted against the guidance in respect of equalities. Now, sticking with equalities, the public sector equality duty. The government have now published guidance it says will help public authorities in England, Wales and Scotland comply with this duty in their policies, programmes and services. It replaces the Government Equalities Office's 2011 guidance. That's the Equality Act 2010, Public Sector Equality Duty, What Do I Need to Know? And the Equality Act 2010, Specific Duties to Support the Equality Duty. So the general duty can be found in sections 149 to 157 of the Equality Act 2010, and it's supported by specific duties found in regulations. The general duty requires decision makers to have due regard to the need to eliminate conduct prohibited by the Act, advance equality of opportunity, and foster good relations in relation to activities such as recommending new or revised public policy to a minister, publishing a consultation document, and designing and providing a public service. Now, the specific duties help decision makers to perform the general duty more effectively, so says the government, and the guidance states that the duty does not dictate a particular outcome. The level of due regard considered sufficient in any particular context depends on the facts. The duty should always be applied in a proportionate way depending on the circumstances of the case and the seriousness of the potential equality impacts on those with protected characteristics. Overly bureaucratic and burdensome approaches, the government says, without reference to the equality aims specified in the legislation, should be avoided. So interestingly, the government states that public authorities must not gold plate their compliance with the duty at the unjustified expense of the taxpayer and of private or voluntary sector contractors. Similarly, regulators should not try to impose the duty on private companies that would never be bound by it. The guidance also includes a myth buster with statements such as I've treated everyone the same and therefore I'm compliant, debunked. The one relating to I must publish an equality impact assessment is interesting, where the government states the anticipation of publication could even have a chilling effect on decision makers' consideration and records. In any event, Dennis, it's a very important document for lawyers to be aware of in the public sector. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that 2024 is going to be a big election year. Tell us more, Dennis.
Well, yes, back to 2024, of course, being an election year. Yes, the general election, of course. And it could be in the spring. It'll probably be in the autumn, or at the latest, January 2025. But whenever it happens, what issues are concerning election experts at the present time? Here's more on this. Experts predict the general election will be perilous and chaotic. So why are officials nervy before a likely UK election during 2024? While the date of the next UK general election itself remains in the hands of the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, one thing is certain. When the campaign begins, it has the potential to be one of the most perilous and chaotic in the country's history for a variety of reasons. But assuming he opts for an autumn election, as most pundits expect, beyond the politics, there will be a series of new factors in play that are making electoral officials and even government ministers very nervous. The first is an entirely self-imposed challenge. This will be the first national general election which voters will have to show photo ID at the polling station, something ubiquitous in many other countries, but made more tricky in the UK given the lack of national ID cards. Surveys have shown already only a limited knowledge of the new rules, and if large numbers of would-be voters are turned away, particularly those from more vulnerable communities who are less likely to possess the necessary documents, it could create accusations of unfairness. And a parallel worry is a potential shortage of electoral officials. UK elections are largely run by a long-standing army of local people paid a one-off fee, and there have been warnings that many of these are deciding that having to turn away lots of potential voters is a step too far. And when it comes to external threats and concerns about hacking, disinformation, and other malevolence from outside actors, the UK is in the peculiar position of being both less vulnerable than many other nations, but also less prepared. Unlike some other countries, for example the US, the votes in a UK general election are cast and counted entirely by hand, making attempts to distort the actual result almost impossible. Joe Burton, Professor of International Security at Lancaster University, said it would be very difficult for hackers literally to affect the tabulation of the votes and affect the vote count. So I think our electoral processes are probably safe in that regard. But if you're hacking and leaking voter data and foreign actors are targeting and trying to compile databases on eligible UK voters, that in itself undermines trust and confidence in the democratic process. And Peter Stanyan, Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators, says, "We predict that despite the never-ending pressure, voters can have confidence the electoral sector will deliver as it always does." We also predict, however, that the spectre of failure, actual or perceived, is looming larger by the day. 2024 will prove to be a pivotal year in the delivery of UK elections whenever the general election is called. And it is this issue of confidence that could prove problematic for the UK, not least after it emerged last year that the Electoral Commission was subjected to a cyber attack, which accessed the data of 40 million voters and went undetected for a year. What plans are your council making for the general election? What will you be doing that's different to last time? Let us know on the LLG forum page. Helen.
Well, we all get jumpy around election time, Dennis, but never fear. LLG will be holding an elections conference on the 1st of March. That's a remote conference, a one-day conference to make sure our members and anyone else involved in the elections process know what they're doing and know how to troubleshoot. So do take a look at our training pages for more on that. Now, in my final segment, Dennis, I've been covering the Post Office inquiry for some time in the Grapevine and vlog. And finally, off the back of a sterling ITV drama, the UK has woken up to the plight of hundreds of postmasters wrongly accused of theft. So, reported in the Gazette, one of the solicitors who helped to expose the Post Office scandal has said that lawyers should be a potential target for investigations into who caused it. James Hartley, who's a partner at Freeths, and he was featured in Mr. Bates against the Post Office, said in a Times radio interview that while lawyers for the Post Office involved in prosecutions over the years might not face criminal prosecutions, they should be subject to regulatory action. So the SRA's position, which was to wait until the end of the public inquiry, has been under the spotlight since the public outcry on the treatment of the postmasters. The Gazette again reported last week that the Solicitors Regulation Authority has no plans to fast-track potential prosecutions of lawyers involved in the Post Office scandal. The last phase of the inquiry, which started in 2020, I should add, and was converted to a statutory inquiry in 2021, is scheduled to commence in the summer, so I just cannot see how any action would be considered prior to 2025. That's 5 years. So on that note, you can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to Bulletin number 1 of 2024, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Have a good